The morning started soft for Ernest Brooks. Warm light slid across his lined face as he stepped onto the driveway, one hand on his cane, the other adjusting his glasses. Beside him, Leela's eyebrows pinched together, worry already settling between them before a single word was spoken. Her arm wrapped around his, holding a little tighter than usual. His shoulders tried to stay straight, but there was a slight tremor in the way his chest rose and fell. They both stared at the unfamiliar man in a tailored suit standing in front of their sedan. The man's jaw was tight, lips pressed in a practiced line. Clipboard hugged to his chest, he angled his body as if he already owned the space. His feet were planted wide, polished shoes pointed at the elderly couple like an accusation. Behind them, the quiet suburban street looked harmless. Freshly cut lawns, white fences, children's bikes tipped over near driveways. The open trunk of their car broke the picture, exposing neatly folded grocery bags and Ernest's worn walking stick lying inside like an afterthought. The air felt heavier than the clouds suggested. A slight breeze brushed Leela's hair, but instead of cooling her, it raised goosebumps along her arms. A passing jogger slowed, eyes flicking from the suited man to the couple, then sped up, pretending not to see. Silence stretched, sharper than any raised voice. Neighbors peeked from windows, blinds shifting just enough to catch a glimpse. No one stepped outside. Ernest's fingers tightened around the curved handle of his cane. He could feel the old ache in his knee, but the pain in his chest was newer, born from years of being looked at like a problem to be managed. A small part of him wondered if this was somehow his fault, if he had misunderstood a bill, missed a payment, failed his wife. The man with the clipboard lifted his arm and pointed, calm and clinical, as if this were just another task on a long list. He had no idea that the way he pointed today was the first crack in a life that would soon collapse around him. Ernest felt the weight of that pointed finger more than the morning air. His brows drew together, eyes damp with a confusion he didn't want Leela to notice. But she did. She always did. Her hand slid up his arm, steadying him even though her own shoulders had begun to tremble. The suited man shifted his stance, chin lifting slightly as if to look down on them from just a few inches higher. His expression never softened. If anything, his eyes narrowed with the confidence of someone who believed he wouldn't be questioned. He tapped the clipboard lightly, an impatient rhythm that echoed judgment more than duty. Behind him, the couple's sedan sat still and vulnerable. The morning sun glared off its windshield, making the scene feel staged, almost theatrical. The open trunk exposed everything they had prepared for the day: groceries, medications, Ernest's extra cane, and Leela's cardigan folded neatly in case the breeze got cooler. It all looked too personal for a stranger to invade. A quiet tension settled over the street. The houses, lined up neatly with manicured hedges, seemed to shrink away from the confrontation, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. A distant lawn mower cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence far too deliberate. Inside that silence, Ernest's confidence flickered. He felt 60 years of lessons to stay polite, stay calm, avoid escalation, tighten around his ribs. His throat tightened, and his chest strained as he tried to swallow the rising sting of shame. Leela's grip tightened in a silent plea not to let this moment break him. A dark SUV rolled slowly down the street, its engine low and smooth, pulling into a driveway a few houses down. The man who stepped out paused mid-motion, eyes catching the tension before the door even closed. He didn't move toward them yet, but something in the way his posture stiffened suggested recognition and concern beginning to bloom. Ernest didn't see him. Leela didn't see him. But the repo agent glanced in his direction and dismissed him just as quickly, assuming his audience would remain powerless and compliant. A dangerous assumption, one that would soon unravel everything he believed he controlled. The repo agent finally broke the silence, not with words the couple could hear, but with a slow exhale that curled into the air like impatience made visible. His jaw shifted sideways, a subtle grind of teeth that revealed his irritation at the delay. He angled his clipboard toward them as if presenting evidence, though neither Ernest nor Leela had been given a chance to see a single line. Ernest's eyes dropped toward the pavement. It wasn't submission. It was the instinctive reflex of a man who had learned over time that eye contact could be mistaken for defiance. His shoulders rounded a little, breath shallow, as though he wished he could shield Leela with his own body. But Leela moved closer before he could try, slipping slightly in front of him, her chin lifting in fragile defiance even as her heartbeat thudded visibly at her neck. The agent tilted his head, studying Leela as if she were an obstacle rather than a person. His brows tightened, displeasure creeping across his face at her attempt to stand firm. One hand shifted to his hip, elbow jutting outward, a posture meant to claim authority, space, and control. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again. A dog barked in the distance, loud enough to echo off the nearby houses and cut through the quiet tension. A curtain moved in a window across the street, someone choosing to watch but not intervene. The world had a way of stepping back when humiliation arrived dressed in paperwork and confidence. Ernest's mind spun through numbers, bank statements, receipts, payments he knew he had handled on time. A sudden uncertainty crawled into his thoughts, replacing clarity with doubt. Had he missed something? Misread something? Mixed up dates? He felt his chest tighten as the possibility gnawed at him. Leela sensed that drop in him. She pressed closer, whispering reassurance without speaking aloud. Her hands trembled faintly, but her gaze stayed locked on the repo agent, refusing to let him read the fear running through her. At the edge of the scene, the young man who had stepped out of the SUV leaned forward, attention sharpening. Recognition had finally arrived in his eyes, recognition of the couple, of the unfolding disrespect, of the magnitude of the mistake being made. He hadn't moved yet, but the stillness in his body carried the weight of a storm preparing to break. The young man stayed half-hidden behind his open car door, his posture frozen in a moment of disbelief. His eyes narrowed first in confusion, then sharpened with a sudden, unmistakable jolt of recognition. The tilt of Ernest's shoulders, the way Leela steadied him, the familiar tremor in her hands, details he'd known his entire life. His breath hitched not loudly, but deeply enough that his chest rose with a slow, stunned pause. He stepped out fully from behind the door, his polished shoes finding the pavement with deliberate precision. Each step carried tension, controlled but dangerous, the kind that built when someone tried to hold back instinct. His body leaned slightly forward, drawn toward the confrontation as if gravity itself demanded he move. A tightness spread across his jaw, the muscles flexing beneath skin that had suddenly cooled. Meanwhile, Ernest didn't notice him yet. He was too caught in the quiet collapse happening inside himself, the sinking belief that he had somehow failed. His hand trembled slightly on his cane. His shoulders slumped deeper as if invisible weight had been placed upon them. Leela saw the young man first. Her eyes widened, a flicker of relief crossing her face before fear smothered it again. She didn't call out, she didn't wave. She simply straightened, her spine stiffening with the instinctive hope that someone who cared was near. The repo agent followed her gaze for a moment, glancing toward the approaching figure. His attention flicked over the man's tailored suit, the high-end car behind him, the purposeful stride. For a second, something uncertain passed through his expression, a hint of hesitation, a brief crack in his confidence. But he dismissed it, assuming the stranger was unrelated, just another neighbor watching. He turned back to the couple with a clipped, rehearsed posture, resuming his stance of superiority. The clipboard pressed firmly against his chest like a shield he had come to rely on. His brows lowered again, preparing to assert authority once more. But the atmosphere had already changed. The young man's presence shifted the air, thickening it with an unseen pressure that spread across the quiet street. Even the leaves on nearby trees seemed still, hesitating in the calm before something inevitable. The repo agent had unknowingly placed himself at the center of a storm he had no idea was forming, and it was drawing closer with every step. The young man's steps slowed as he approached, each one more intentional than the last. His eyes moved from the open trunk to the clipboard, then finally to the tight lines around Ernest's mouth. A sharp, protective heat spread through his chest, the kind that rose when someone you loved was being quietly cornered. His breath deepened, steady but heavy, as if preparing his body for the confrontation he already knew was coming. Ernest kept his gaze lowered, unaware of the figure closing in behind him. His fingers curled tighter around the cane, knuckles whitening under the strain. He felt smaller than he had in years, reduced not by age, but by the silent accusation hanging between him and the repo man. A soft tremor passed through his shoulders, barely noticeable unless you knew him well. Leela shifted subtly, trying to create a small barrier with her body. Her hands shook, but her chin held firm with a fragile determination. She kept glancing toward the young man, their unspoken connection flickering across her eyes like a lifeline she feared to reach for too early. The slight rise in her chest betrayed the tension she carried, the delicate balance between fear and hope. The repo agent finally noticed the young man's steady advance. He straightened, shoulders pulling back in an attempt to reinforce his authority. His stance widened just enough to claim more space, to reassert dominance before anyone could challenge it. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the expression of someone convinced he was still fully in control. Around them, the neighborhood remained eerily still. A sprinkler clicked in the distance, spraying in slow arcs that shimmered under the morning sun. But the sound felt oddly distant, swallowed by the tension thickening around the scene. Even the birds quieted, as if the natural world sensed an imbalance in the air. The young man finally stopped just a few steps behind the couple. His posture was no longer hesitant. It was firm, steady, rooted. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curled slightly, carrying the weight of a decision he had not fully voiced yet. His eyes locked onto the repo agent with a focused intensity that made the man's confident smirk falter. He wasn't intervening yet, not with words, not with movement, but the moment held the sharp edge of change, like the silent second before storm clouds crack open and reveal everything hidden beneath. And the repo agent, still unaware of how close he stood to the end of his authority, had just taken his last moment of unchallenged confidence. The shift happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The repo agent adjusted his stance, lifting the clipboard higher as if preparing to finalize whatever decision he believed he had the right to enforce. His expression hardened, eyes narrowing with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. His brows drew together, a practiced gesture of authority he had worn many times before. Ernest felt the pressure before he saw it. A subtle tightening in the air, a heaviness settling across his shoulders that had nothing to do with age. He swallowed hard, throat dry, the familiar ache of helplessness curling into his chest like an unwelcome shadow. He tried to stand taller, but his body betrayed him, hunching slightly as doubt pressed deeper into his ribs. Leela shifted closer, her fingers brushing his arm in a quiet attempt to anchor him. Her breath trembled through parted lips, the fear she tried to hide flickering in her eyes. But something else stirred beneath the fear, a faint but growing sense that the moment was no longer as one-sided as it seemed. She wasn't sure why, but she held Ernest a little tighter, as if bracing for a change she could feel but not yet see. Behind them, the young man stepped forward just enough for his shadow to stretch across the pavement toward the repo agent's shoes. A small movement, but deliberate, the kind of shift that signaled attention, presence, and unspoken warning. His jaw flexed again, a pulse of restrained anger moving beneath his skin. His breaths came slower now, steadier, as though he was gathering himself before breaking a silence that had gone on far too long. The repo agent noticed the shadow first. He looked down, irritation flashing across his face at the intrusion. His head lifted, eyes flicking toward the young man with a dismissive glance meant to reassert control. But for the first time, a thin crack of uncertainty widened in his expression, a subtle tightening around his mouth, a tiny shift in his posture. The environment responded to that crack. A breeze swept through, rustling the leaves in a low whisper that carried across the quiet street. The world felt suspended, caught between the tension of what had happened and the tension of what was about to unfold. Even the distant sounds, the hum of traffic, the chirp of birds, seemed muted under the weight of the moment. Ernest still didn't turn. He didn't yet realize the force gathering behind him, the one presence capable of shifting everything. But the repo agent felt it now, a growing pressure pushing against the authority he thought he owned. And in the silent space between breaths, the balance of power began to tilt. The repo agent tried to reclaim control before it slipped fully from his hands. He lifted the clipboard with a sharp, practiced motion, angling it toward the couple as if its presence alone could silence any resistance. His expression hardened into a mask he'd worn many times, the blend of authority, impatience, and quiet superiority that rarely met challenge. But this time, a thin tremor rippled across his jaw, barely visible yet undeniably present. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight forward as though preparing to assert dominance once more. His shoulders squared, chest lifting in a posture meant to signal confidence he no longer fully possessed. His eyes flicked from the elderly couple to the young man behind them, lingering just a little too long, betraying the first hints of unease. The air around him thickened, pressing his breath shallower, tighter. Ernest glanced up briefly, noticing the repo agent's change in demeanor without understanding the cause. His brows knit together, confusion deepening the fine lines on his forehead. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to ask a question but feared the answer. The weight of humiliation still clung to him, sinking into his shoulders like a burden he didn't deserve. Leela shifted her stance, instinctively sensing a shift she couldn't yet name. Her fingers relaxed just a little on Ernest's arm, her gaze drifting toward the figure behind them. She didn't turn fully, not yet, but the soft lift of her chin revealed hope beginning to surface through the fear. Her heartbeat, once frantic, slowed into something steadier, though tension still coiled beneath her ribs. The young man stepped forward again, closing the last few feet between himself and the tense scene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach out. He simply positioned himself beside Ernest, his presence unmistakable, his expression carved from a storm held barely in check. His eyes locked onto the repo agent with a steady, unblinking intensity that made the man's breath hitch. The repo agent faltered for half a second, a tiny backward shift of his heel, too subtle for most to notice. But the moment betrayed everything. A crack in authority, a question forming where certainty once lived. He gripped the clipboard tighter, fingers whitening around the edges as though it were the last barrier between himself and consequences he didn't yet understand. Across the street, a door creaked open as a neighbor peeked out, sensing the rising tension. The environment felt electric now, charged with a quiet energy that settled across the pavement like static before a storm. Even the sunlight seemed sharper, casting long shadows that stretched toward the repo agent as if marking him. The last second of unchallenged authority slipped from his grasp, and he felt it. The young man stepped fully into the space beside his parents, and the entire tone of the morning shifted with him. His presence wasn't loud or dramatic. It was controlled, grounded, the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. A slow inhale lifted his chest, expanding with the weight of everything he was seeing and everything he was about to do. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the repo agent with a focus that stripped away any illusion of authority the man still clung to. Ernest felt the nearness before he recognized it. A warmth at his side, a familiar steadiness that calmed the tremor in his hands. He turned slightly, confusion pulling his brows together, eyes widening as they landed on the face he knew better than his own reflection. A quiet gasp slipped from him, not fear, but the fragile release of someone who had been holding himself together with every ounce of strength he had left. Leela's reaction was softer but deeper. Her hand drifted toward the young man as if drawn by instinct, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a silent greeting weighted with relief. Her shoulders loosened, tension melting from her spine in slow waves as her heartbeat steadied. Yet beneath that relief lived something sharper, the sting of seeing her son witness their humiliation. The repo agent didn't soften. If anything, he hardened further, mistaking the young man's calm presence for posturing rather than warning. His chin lifted, eyes tightening, the faint smirk returning as he tried to reestablish control. He angled his clipboard higher, tapping a corner of the paper as if it contained unshakable truth. His stance widened, elbows jutting slightly to claim more space. But the facade was thinner now, a layer of confidence stretched over growing uncertainty. The young man didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His expression told a story more forceful than anything said aloud. The piercing disappointment in his gaze, the simmering anger held tightly at the edges, the unmistakable protectiveness radiating from every inch of him. His breath remained steady, but his jaw tensed, the muscle pulsing like a warning signal. Around them, the atmosphere thickened. A car slowed as it passed, the driver's head turning just long enough to sense something unfolding. A breeze rustled the edges of the clipboard, making the paper flutter against the agent's grip. It was the kind of moment when the world itself seemed to lean in, anticipating a fracture. The young man finally shifted his weight, a quiet repositioning of his feet that placed him squarely between his parents and the repo agent. It was protective. It was deliberate. It was the first physical sign that the power in this scene no longer belonged to the man with the clipboard. The repo agent felt it, and for the first time, the certainty in his eyes flickered. The repo agent tried to hold his ground, but the balance of the moment was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp it. He adjusted his clipboard again, this time with a sharper motion meant to reassert dominance. But his lips pressed into a thin, strained line, the expression of someone who suddenly wasn't sure if he still controlled the room, even though they were standing outside. A faint twitch pulled at the edges of his left eye, revealing the tension building beneath his practiced authority. The young man didn't move closer. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, presence steady and unshakable. His eyes bore into the repo agent with a quiet fire, not explosive, but concentrated, the kind that burned deeper the longer it was held. His chest rose with a slow inhale, grounding himself before he let emotion dictate his next action. Ernest stared at his son, bewildered by the collision of pride and shame swelling inside him. The lines on his face tightened, not from age, but from the painful realization that his son had seen him at a moment of helplessness he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid. His fingers loosened slightly around the cane, then tightened again, wrestling with the instinct to apologize for something that wasn't his fault. Leela's eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and quiet heartbreak. She touched her son's back with a trembling hand, the gesture small but filled with a lifetime's worth of gratitude. Her other hand drifted toward Ernest, bridging them together, grounding the family in the middle of the rising storm. But beneath the softness of her touch lived a growing strength, a simmering belief that the tide was finally about to turn. The repo agent stepped forward, trying to reclaim the ground he felt slipping away. His shoulders stiffened, and he angled the clipboard toward the young man with forced confidence. He tapped the paper again, harder this time, as if the sound alone could validate the authority he was beginning to lose. His throat bobbed with a swallow he hoped went unnoticed, but the tension in his neck betrayed him. The young man's gaze dropped to the clipboard for the first time. He studied it silently, eyes narrowing just enough to signal a shift, not in anger but in understanding. His expression remained calm, but a new sharpness entered his posture, a readiness settling in his stance. His breaths deepened, each one slower and more controlled, as though he was preparing to unravel everything the agent believed was indisputable. The environment mirrored the shift. A mailbox rattled softly in the breeze. Two curtains parted simultaneously from neighboring homes. Even the sunlight seemed to tilt, casting a shadow across the repo agent's shoes while leaving the young man illuminated. The repo agent didn't fully grasp what that meant yet. But the moment he saw the young man's expression shift from confusion to certainty, something inside him faltered. A fault line had formed, thin, quiet, and ready to split everything open. The repo agent felt that fault line widening, and he rushed to patch it the only way he knew how, by doubling down. He lifted the clipboard higher, angling it toward the young man as if the paper itself could shield him from the unraveling authority beneath his skin. His lips tightened, his breath hitched, and a thin sheen of tension settled across his forehead. He tried to stare the young man down, but his gaze wavered, drifting for a split second before he forced it back into place. He stepped closer, just an inch, but enough to broadcast an attempt at dominance. His shoulders rose, then locked into a rigid posture, the kind that tried to say he wasn't afraid even as fear quietly threaded through his movements. His knuckles whitened around the clipboard, gripping it like a lifeline. The young man didn't flinch. His expression didn't shift. He simply held the repo agent's gaze with a cold, steady calm that made the air feel heavier. His jaw tightened as he inhaled, the rise of his chest slow and controlled, a warning wrapped in restraint. He didn't need aggression to be powerful. The silence around him was already louder than anything the agent could say. Ernest watched the interaction unfold with a painful mix of awe and guilt. His eyes softened with pride as he recognized the quiet strength in his son, the strength he'd tried to protect rather than burden. But guilt pressed into him like a second weight, the guilt of letting his son find him bowed, humiliated, standing helpless in a situation he didn't deserve. His throat tightened, and moisture blurred his vision, but he blinked it back, refusing to let it fall. Leela's breath trembled again, but this time not from fear. Her shoulders straightened as she stepped slightly behind her son, drawing courage from the simple fact that they were no longer alone. She watched the Repo agent closely, studied the cracks forming in his confidence, the fading force in his stance, the growing confusion tightening his features. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt the faint spark of safety beginning to glow. The Repo agent, sensing the dynamic turning against him, scrambled to reclaim the moment. He tapped the clipboard harder, too hard, the sound sharp and unnatural. He thrust it forward another inch as if pushing proof that didn't quite hold its shape anymore. But his movements were rushed now, unbalanced, revealing the desperation he tried so hard to hide. The young man finally looked at the document long enough for the Repo agent to mistake his silence for hesitation. That mistake lit a brief spark of overconfidence in the agent's eyes, a spark that dimmed just as quickly when the young man's expression shifted. Not in anger, not in confusion, but in realization. A slow, dawning clarity that tightened his features and sharpened his gaze into something razor-focused. The Repo agent's breath caught. Something in the young man's face, a flicker of recognition, a controlled fury, sent a shiver of uncertainty racing up his spine. He took a half step back without meaning to, and in that subtle retreat, the last illusion of control slipped from his hands. The young man's eyes moved slowly across the clipboard now, scanning the printed lines with a focus so sharp it seemed to still the air around him. His expression tightened with every passing second, not in confusion but in recognition. A small shift happened in his jaw, a tiny clench, the kind that only appeared when he was fighting the urge to react too quickly. The muscles along his neck pulled taut, holding back a surge of disbelief mixed with something darker. Ernest watched him, unable to decipher the details, but sensing the emotional storm building behind his son's stern expression. His own breath grew shallow, caught between fear of what was happening and the desperate hope that his son somehow understood this better than he did. The cane trembled slightly in his grip as the weight of helplessness pressed deeper into his chest. He felt small, exposed, and painfully aware of how fragile dignity could be in the wrong hands. Leela, noticing the tension spreading through her son's posture, placed her hand gently on his arm. Her touch was soft but steady, grounding him with a mother's instinctive reassurance. Her eyes searched his profile, trying to understand the thoughts racing behind his controlled exterior. But what she saw there, that simmering restraint, that familiar flicker of anger, made her stomach tighten. The Repo agent misread every detail. He interpreted the young man's silence as hesitation, his focused stare as confusion, his stiffness as uncertainty. A faint smirk returned to the edges of his mouth, though it struggled to take full shape. His shoulders lifted with renewed arrogance, attempting to reclaim the space he had begun to lose. He tapped the clipboard again, this time softer but with forced confidence, as if reminding everyone that he held the authority. His chest rose with a shallow breath, and when he exhaled, it carried a note of impatience layered over growing insecurity. His eyes darted between the couple and the young man, trying to assess which of them would break first. He didn't realize the ground beneath him had already begun to crack beyond repair. The young man finally lifted his gaze from the document. His eyes, once steady, now blazed with a controlled intensity that made the Repo agent freeze mid-breath. There was no confusion in that stare, only certainty. A certainty that cut through the facade of the clipboard, the posture, the manufactured authority. He inhaled once, slow and deliberate, the breath expanding his chest with the weight of a truth he hadn't planned to reveal this morning. His next exhale came quieter, a release of the last fraction of restraint holding back the storm. The Repo agent felt the shift instantly. His smirk faltered, his chest tightened, and his grip around the clipboard trembled just enough to betray him. He didn't know what the young man had realized, but he knew, unmistakably, that his power in the moment was slipping beyond his reach. And as the young man took one steady step forward, the entire confrontation balanced on a razor's edge, ready to tip into the truth that would change everything. The young man's step forward changed the temperature of the air itself. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, deliberate, the kind of movement that signaled a shift in position rather than a threat. But the repo agent's reaction betrayed how deeply it rattled him. His shoulders jerked back a fraction, his breath catching in his chest before he forced it into a stiff exhale. His fingers tightened around the clipboard until the edges curled slightly beneath his grip. The young man didn't raise his voice or posture for dominance. He simply stood closer, close enough now to read the fine print clearly. His eyes scanned the paperwork again, lingering on specific lines with a recognition that deepened the tension across his brow. A faint crease formed between his eyes, the look he wore only when something wasn't just wrong, but offensively wrong. Ernest's breath hitched as he watched his son's expression sharpen. A subtle tremble passed through his hand, the cane shifting slightly against the pavement. He felt the familiar ache of fear pressing into his ribs, mixing with something more fragile, hope he was almost scared to feel. His voice didn't rise, but his heart pounded against his chest as if trying to reach out for clarity. Leela's fingertips tightened gently on her son's arm. Her body leaned toward him, seeking the truth he now carried within his tightening jaw. Her eyes widened as she recognized the expression, the same one he used to wear as a boy when he saw someone being mistreated on the playground. The same one he carried into adulthood, sharpened by responsibility, softened by empathy, fueled by his need to protect. The repo agent tried to salvage the moment. He straightened, forced his shoulders into a rigid square, and cleared his throat in an attempt to regain composure. He angled the clipboard toward the young man with a stiff motion, tapping the corner again as if the document were unbeatable proof. But his eyes told another story, a flicker of doubt, a tightening around the edges, a darting glance that revealed fear beginning to rise beneath his practiced authority. The young man finally looked up from the paper. His expression was calm, far too calm for the repo agent's comfort. His breath was steady, but the slight tension in his jaw signaled the shift happening inside him, the moment he crossed from silent witness to active force. He took another slow inhale, grounding himself. Then he extended one finger toward a specific section of the clipboard, tapping it with a precision that made the agent flinch. It was a small gesture, but loaded, a gesture of knowledge, of certainty, of someone who did not just disagree but understood exactly what was wrong. The repo agent's face paled. His breath stuttered. A bead of sweat slipped near his temple, catching the sunlight before disappearing along his skin. Because the young man wasn't questioning the document. He was recognizing something in it, something that made the agent's confidence crumble in a single, silent heartbeat. And as the breeze swept through the quiet street, the first undeniable crack in the repo agent's authority split wide open. The young man kept his finger on that one line of the document, holding it there long enough for the repo agent's pulse to visibly throb at his neck. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence was sharper than accusation, more precise than argument. It forced the repo agent to confront the one thing he'd avoided since stepping onto the driveway, the possibility that he was wrong. The agent's breath grew shallow. His eyes darted between the paper and the young man's face, searching for some sign that he had misunderstood the gesture. But the calm certainty in that stare left no room for misinterpretation. A tiny tremor ran through the agent's fingers, the clipboard shifting slightly in his grip. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsure of himself. Ernest watched in stunned silence. He didn't understand the details, but he recognized the shift, a reversal so subtle yet powerful that it made his chest tighten with a confusing blend of fear, awe, and relief. His eyes drifted down to the document, squinting at the print he couldn't quite make sense of. He felt a tremble ripple through him, not from weakness this time, but from the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they were not the ones in the wrong. Leela leaned in closer, her grip on her son tightening. She studied his expression, the set jaw, the narrowed eyes, the steady breath, and her heart eased just enough for a small warmth to settle in her chest. He wasn't confused. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was analyzing, calculating, preparing. She recognized the look from years of watching him solve problems bigger than himself. The repo agent, trying to salvage dignity, pulled the clipboard back a fraction. But the young man's hand stayed in place, not touching him, just holding the space with unspoken authority. The agent froze, unsure whether to continue asserting himself or to retreat under the weight of that silent challenge. His confidence wavered visibly now, shoulders stiff, jaw tightening, breath catching in uneven bursts. The young man lowered his arm slowly, but his eyes never left the agent's. He tapped the document again, this time on a different line, a line the repo agent had skimmed past without realizing its significance, a line that invalidated everything. The agent's eyes flicked down, scanned it, and widened. Color drained from his face. His mouth parted slightly, as if he were trying to form a response but couldn't find the shape of the words. Around them, the neighborhood seemed to lean closer. A door clicked open down the street. A car engine quieted as the driver paused to watch. Even the wind slowed, hanging thickly in the charged silence. The young man took one slow breath, grounding himself before delivering whatever truth now sat fully formed behind his steady gaze. The repo agent stepped back half a foot, involuntarily, the fear now fully visible in the tension around his eyes and the shallow rise of his chest. He didn't know who he was dealing with, but he finally understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had made a mistake that went far beyond an address, a document, or a car. And the consequences of that mistake were about to surface. The young man finally lifted the clipboard from the repo agent's trembling hands, not by force, but by presence. His fingers brushed the edge just long enough for the agent to instinctively let go, as if the weight of the paper had suddenly become too much to carry. The young man held it now, steady and centered, his posture straightening with a quiet authority that made the morning light sharpen around him. His brows pulled together as he studied the page one final time, confirming what he already knew. Ernest watched his son with a fragile intensity, his heart thudding in slow, heavy beats. He saw the shift, the transformation from silent witness to undeniable force, and something warm flickered behind his eyes. Not pride yet, something softer, like the faint glow of dignity beginning to return after being stripped away. His grip on the cane loosened, his body lifting by a fraction as though the crushing weight on his shoulders had eased. Leela stood perfectly still beside them, her breath held somewhere between her ribs. Her hand hovered near her son's arm, not touching now, not grounding, just witnessing. She watched his face closely. The controlled fury in his jaw, the calm restraint in his eyes, the faint tremble of emotion he refused to let surface. She saw the boy she raised, the man he became, and the protector he had always quietly trained himself to be. The repo agent couldn't hold his composure anymore. His shoulders sagged slightly, the confidence draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. His feet shifted backward in small, jerky movements, not retreating fully, but betraying the instinct to flee. His eyes darted around the neighborhood as if searching for someone to validate his authority, someone to confirm he had not just lost control. But every person watching from a distance saw the same thing he did, his posture collapsing under the weight of his own mistake. The young man lowered the clipboard enough for the agent to meet his eyes. The silence between them burned hotter than any confrontation. That silence said everything. You didn't check the VIN, you didn't check the contract, you didn't check the ownership, you acted first, you assumed first, you humiliated first. The repo agent swallowed hard, throat tightening as realization spread through him like a slow, cold flood. His breathing grew uneven. His chest rose in short, shallow bursts. He looked at the couple again, really looked, and saw the pain he had caused, the disrespect he had delivered without hesitation. He knew then that this wasn't just a procedural mistake. This was a moral one, a human one. The young man took a half step closer, lifting the clipboard so the agent could see the highlighted line clearly. There it was, the dealership name, printed in bold, unmistakable text. A name that matched the one embroidered on the young man's cuff, the one engraved on the luxury car parked behind him. The repo agent's pupils contracted. His lips parted in a silent gasp. A chill crawled up his spine. He understood now. He understood exactly who he was standing in front of, and the cliff beneath his authority crumbled completely. The young man held the clipboard between them like a mirror, forcing the repo agent to face the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. He simply angled the paper upward, letting the bold dealership name at the top speak louder than anything words could offer. His expression remained controlled, but the tightness around his jaw revealed the depth of the anger he kept restrained behind his calm exterior. The repo agent's breath faltered. He stared at the name, blinking rapidly as his mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. His chest tightened, shoulders curling inward as though trying to shield himself from the impact of his own misjudgment. A faint tremor ran through his arms, weakening the posture he had clung to since the moment he stepped onto the driveway. Ernest watched the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He felt his son's presence like a shield forming around him, a barrier he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. His eyes softened with a pride he couldn't yet voice. But beneath that pride lived a deeper ache, the ache of knowing his son had been forced to step into a moment that should never have happened. A moment born not from paperwork, but from assumption, and from the quiet cruelty of being underestimated. Leela's gaze flicked between her son and the repo agent, her breath growing steadier as she saw the truth finally surface. Her fingers brushed her husband's hand, grounding him with a gentle squeeze. She felt the tension slowly leaving Ernest's shoulders, dissolving beneath the realization that this humiliation was never theirs to carry. Her eyes glistened, not with fear now, but with the emotional release of a woman who had been holding herself together long enough. The repo agent attempted to speak, a small, shaky intake of air that faltered before forming words. His lips parted, then closed again as panic tightened his throat. His eyes darted to the luxury car behind the young man, to the embroidered cuff, to the dealership name on the clipboard, and finally back to the young man's steady gaze. Each detail struck him like a blow, driving home the truth he had been too arrogant to consider. He took another step back, this one larger, more revealing. The clipboard slipped slightly in his loosening grip, as if even the paper itself refused to support him now. His breath grew louder, not noisy, but strained, the sound of a man beginning to understand that he had crossed a line he could not easily retreat from. The young man finally lowered the clipboard, slowly, deliberately. His eyes never left the repo agent's. There was no gloating in his expression, no satisfaction. Only disappointment so sharp it made the agent's shame deepen. The silence between them grew thick, pressing into the space like a tangible weight. A weight that said, you judged first. You acted without checking. You treated them like they didn't matter. And now you stand before the person who holds the power you assumed they never had. The repo agent swallowed hard, the sound audible in the heavy stillness. His authority was gone. His confidence was shattered. And for the first time, he felt the full gravity of the mistake he had made, a mistake that would not simply vanish because he wished it would. The moment lingered, stretched, tightened, and then tilted as the consequences began to take shape around him. A single truth hovered above them all, ready to fall like a hammer. The truth finally dropped into the silence like a weight the street could feel. The young man lifted his wrist just enough for the morning light to catch the embroidery on his cuff. A small detail, subtle and elegant, the dealership's initials stitched in silver thread. The same initials stamped in bold across the paperwork. The same initials the repo agent had ignored when he first glanced at the car behind him. Recognition hit the repo agent like a cold shock. His eyes widened, then narrowed, then widened again as panic scrambled behind them. He looked from the cuff to the luxury sedan to the clipboard and back to the young man's unblinking stare. His breath caught in his throat, chest tightening as realization wrapped around him like a vice. The young man let the silence stretch, giving the agent every second needed to understand the magnitude of his mistake. His posture remained controlled, shoulders steady, chin slightly lowered, gaze sharp enough to cut through any remaining illusion of authority. A slow inhale expanded his chest, not dramatic, but unmistakably final. It was the breath of someone preparing to end something that should never have begun. Ernest saw the transformation fully now, not just a son stepping forward, but a leader stepping into his rightful space. His lips parted slightly, stunned by the complexity of emotions rising inside him. Pride, relief, the sting of having been underestimated, and a deep, aching gratitude he wasn't sure he could ever express. He straightened by an inch, the cane feeling less like support and more like an extension of himself again. Leela's breath softened as she watched her son take command of a moment that had spiraled so far out of their control. Her hands trembled, not from fear now, but from the release of everything she had held inside since the agent stepped onto their driveway. She saw her son not as a boy, or even as the man he became, but as the force he had always been destined to be. Her eyes glistened with a quiet, powerful relief. The repo agent's facade finally broke. His shoulders collapsed inward. His stance faltered. A flush crept up his neck, rising into his cheeks, the unmistakable color of shame. He fumbled to adjust his shirt collar, his breath quickening in uneven bursts. His clipboard dipped low, no longer a weapon of authority, just a thin sheet of paper that exposed him instead of protecting him. He opened his mouth again, a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his dignity. But no words formed. His throat tightened, the truth choking off any excuse he tried to assemble. The young man finally spoke, not with loudness but with quiet weight. A measured correction, a clarification he had held back until now. He didn't need dialogue marks. His voice lived in the air through posture alone. He pointed to the ownership line. The repo agent followed the motion, eyes landing on the name that ended any argument he thought he had. The purchaser, the guarantor, the sole authorized decision-maker was the young man standing in front of him. The agent's knees weakened, his stomach twisted. Every trace of authority drained out of him in a single, shattering realization. He had tried to repossess a car from the owner's parents, without checking who their son was, without checking who he worked for, or rather who worked for him. The equilibrium of the moment collapsed. The quiet storm that had been building finally reached its peak, and the repo agent now stood on the wrong side of a truth he could no longer escape. The next move would not belong to him. The repo agent's collapse didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, in small, revealing fractures, each one exposing the truth he had spent the last several minutes trying to outrun. His shoulders sank first, the rigid posture he'd worn like armor dissolving into something softer, almost hollow. Then his grip loosened, the clipboard dipping toward the pavement as though it had grown too heavy to hold. His eyes darted helplessly between the young man and the elderly couple, searching for some way to undo the moment he had created. The young man didn't move. His stillness was sharper than confrontation, steadier than anger, and heavier than any raised voice could have been. A slow exhale left his chest, not relief, not rage, but a cold, controlled disappointment that seemed to ripple outward into the air itself. His gaze held the repo agent in place, not crushing him with intimidation, but forcing him to confront the weight of what he'd done. His calm had become the most dangerous element in the entire scene. Ernest felt that calm too. He felt it wash over him, steadying the tremble in his hands and loosening the knot in his chest. He lifted his chin slightly, reclaiming a fraction of the dignity the morning had tried to take from him. He looked at his son with a softness that held decades of gratitude, pride, and the ache of every moment he'd spent being underestimated in his own life. For the first time since the confrontation began, he breathed without apology. Leela released a breath she had held so long her chest ached from the strain. Her shoulders lowered, her posture softened, yet her eyes remained sharp, watching, witnessing, remembering. She saw the repo agent for what he truly was now, not a powerful man enforcing rules, but a frightened one facing a truth he'd tried to mask behind paperwork and procedure. Her hand found Ernest's, their fingers intertwining with an unspoken unity stronger than anything the agent had attempted to break. The repo agent finally tried to step forward, as if proximity could soften the consequences. But his body betrayed him. His foot hesitated, wobbling slightly before touching back to the pavement. He tried to steady his breath, but the shakiness only grew more pronounced. His palms dampened against the clipboard. His throat tightened with the sting of humiliation, and the realization that this mistake would follow him longer than he wanted to imagine. The young man didn't let him escape into excuses. He lifted the clipboard again, gently but decisively, and pointed to the dealership's logo stamped at the top, the very logo the repo agent had overlooked. Then he tapped the ownership line, slow and precise, the sound crisp in the quiet street. Each tap was a verdict. Each tap was a reminder. Each tap was a dismantling of the authority the agent had never truly possessed. The agent's breath faltered. Color drained from his face, leaving his expression pale and strained. Tiny beads of sweat formed near his hairline, glistening beneath the morning sun. His jaw trembled as he tried to swallow, the motion visibly difficult. He understood now, fully, painfully, undeniably, that the young man wasn't merely connected to the dealership. He owned the decisions the repo agent thought he controlled. He oversaw the rules the agent believed he was enforcing. He led the institution the agent represented without respect. Around them, the neighborhood watched the unraveling. A mail truck slowed at the end of the street. A couple quietly stepped back from their porch. The world had shifted from observer to witness, and the repo agent felt every pair of unseen eyes pressing into him. The young man closed the clipboard with a soft, final motion. The kind of motion that signaled a verdict had already been made. A quiet, chilling certainty settled in the air. The repo agent wasn't waiting to lose his authority. He had already lost it, and in the stillness that followed, he realized the ground beneath him had disappeared entirely. The repo agent stood suspended in a moment that refused to move forward. His breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one tighter than the last. The clipboard hung limp at his side now, no longer a badge of authority, just a fragile reminder of how quickly power could evaporate when built on assumption rather than truth. His eyes dropped to the pavement, unable to hold the young man's gaze any longer. Shame gathered in the lines of his face, settling like a weight he could no longer hide behind procedure. The young man remained motionless, letting the silence do what confrontation never could, force the agent to sit with the consequences of his actions. His expression stayed calm, but not forgiving. There was firmness in the way he held his shoulders, a collected power in the slow rise and fall of his chest. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply embodied a truth the repo agent had tried to override. That respect should never depend on assumptions. The air felt different now, heavy, still, as if the entire neighborhood had taken a collective breath and refused to release it until the next moment revealed itself. A wind brushed through the trees, lifting the edges of Leela's blouse and carrying the faint smell of cut grass across the driveway. But even the breeze couldn't soften the gravity of the scene. Ernest watched the repo agent with a quiet depth in his eyes. Not anger, not even bitterness. Just the steady, sorrowful recognition of a lifetime spent being underestimated by people who never bothered to look deeper. He stood a little taller now, the cane no longer a symbol of weakness, but a reminder of how much he had survived. His chest rose with a slow inhale, reclaiming the dignity that had been threatened moments earlier. Leela shifted her stance, drawing a half step forward into her son's shadow. Her eyes held a piercing clarity, the kind that remembered every detail of what had been done, every moment of disrespect delivered, every assumption made about who they were and what they deserved. She reached out and smoothed the fabric of Ernest's sleeve, a small gesture of comfort that steadied both of them. Then she turned her gaze back to the agent, watching him with a calm that carried the sharp edge of truth. The repo agent's collapse continued. His knees softened. His shoulders curled inward. He looked suddenly smaller, not physically, but in presence, in certainty, in the fragile belief that his role had ever given him authority over dignity. His mouth opened and closed again, his voice trapped behind a wall of fear and regret. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. But the words tangled in his throat, too heavy to form. The young man finally lifted a hand. Not to threaten, not to dismiss, but to end the moment with a quiet, devastating finality. His palm hovered for a second before closing into a subtle gesture that told the repo agent exactly what he needed to do next. Step back, step away, step out of a situation he had never truly understood. The agent obeyed without question. One step, then another. His feet scraped against the concrete, hesitant, embarrassed, stripped of the force he had arrived with. The retreat was slow, quiet, pathetic in its attempt to preserve any remaining shred of dignity. A car door clicked open behind him. The sound cracked the tense silence, echoing across the driveway like the opening note of the consequences still to come. He froze for a moment, realizing fully that leaving wouldn't erase what just happened. Nothing would. Not today. Not when the young man he had underestimated held not only the truth, but the authority he had pretended to own. As he finally turned away, the weight of everything he'd done, and everything he now risked losing, pressed into his spine with every reluctant step. And the young man watched him go with a calm that was more powerful than anger, because it carried the quiet certainty of someone who was now ready to reveal the full truth of who he really was. The repo agent's retreat stretched into the longest walk of his life. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself had tightened around his ankles. His breath trembled, catching against the rising panic that pressed into his chest in sharp, uneven waves. He no longer looked like the man who had arrived with authority in his stride. He looked like someone who had just watched his career slip through his fingers in real time. He reached his truck door and gripped the handle, knuckles pale and strained. But he didn't climb in. He paused, shoulders shaking under the weight of shame, knowing that the moment he closed that door, the consequences waiting beyond the driveway would become real and unavoidable. The realization tightened around his ribs like a band. Walking away would not end this. It was only the beginning. Behind him, the young man remained rooted in place, but the tone of his presence shifted. The calm he carried was no longer just disappointment. It had grown into something colder, firmer, defined by responsibility rather than emotion. His shoulders squared, posture lifting with the subtle precision of someone stepping fully into authority. The faint breeze caught his suit jacket, revealing the embossed initials on the breast pocket, the same initials that governed every policy the repo agent had violated. He wasn't merely connected to the dealership. He was the dealership. Ernest watched his son with a depth of emotion he couldn't name. He saw the executive, yes, the man who managed contracts, teams, decisions affecting hundreds of people. But he also saw the boy who once stood up to neighborhood bullies, the young man who worked 3 jobs to pay for college, the adult who carried responsibility like a second skin. Pride swelled through his chest, pushing against the cracks humiliation had left there. Not loud pride, not boastful pride, a quiet, powerful pride that tightened his throat and warmed his aging bones. Leela exhaled slowly, her breath trembling with emotion she had been holding back for too long. Her eyes glistened, but not from fear, from the profound relief of witnessing justice unfold in a way she never expected, from the gentle ache of seeing her son step fully into his strength. She slid her hand along Ernest's arm, grounding herself beside the man she had protected for decades, the man who was finally, visibly, protected in return. The repo agent forced himself to turn around. He opened his mouth again, finally finding the breath to attempt an apology. But his voice cracked before the sound could form, the weight of the young man's gaze shutting down every excuse he might have grasped at. His lower lip trembled. His shoulders slumped further. For the first time, he understood the depth of the mistake, not procedural, not clerical, but moral, profoundly moral. And then, just when he thought the humiliation had reached its peak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A vibration sharp enough to jolt him. He hesitated, dread sliding across his face. He didn't want to look, he didn't want to know. But the young man nodded once, a calm, unmistakable signal. Check it. The agent swallowed hard and drew the phone from his pocket. The screen lit up with a message that made his face drain of color. 3 words glared back at him, sent from a number he knew well: "We need to talk." It was from his supervisor. Sent minutes ago, before he even reached his truck. His breath collapsed. His world tilted. Because the young man hadn't revealed the full truth yet, he hadn't needed to. The system itself had already begun responding to the mistake. And as the repo agent stood frozen beside his truck, phone trembling in his hand, he realized with terrifying clarity that the worst consequences were still on their way. The repo agent stood frozen beside his truck, the message on his phone burning into his vision. "We need to talk." 3 words that carried the weight of a collapsing future. 3 words that told him everything he feared was already unfolding behind the scenes. His breath stuttered. His hand trembled. His entire posture folded in on itself as the reality settled over him. There was no path out that didn't lead through consequences he could no longer outrun. He lifted his gaze toward the young man again, almost pleadingly. But the young man's expression had shifted into something final, not cruel, not angry, simply decisive. His shoulders held steady, his chin level, his breath calm. He wasn't acting as a son now. He wasn't acting from emotion. He was acting as the man responsible for the very institution the repo agent represented. And that authority sat across his features like a verdict carved in stone. Slowly, the young man stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice or gesture grandly. He simply positioned himself where his words, steady and measured, could not be misunderstood. His posture conveyed an unspoken command. This ends now. This ends here. This ends under my authority. Ernest and Leela stood behind him, framed by the soft morning light. Their hands were clasped together, their shoulders aligned, their breath easing into a calm they hadn't known since the start of the morning. The humiliation they had endured had not vanished. It lingered in the shadows of the driveway, in the memories of neighbors watching from behind blinds. But it no longer defined them. Their dignity had been restored in the only way that mattered, through truth, through respect, and through the undeniable force of their son's presence. The repo agent tried once more to speak, but his voice cracked into a stutter that never formed a full sentence. His eyes glistened with panic, regret, and a fear far deeper than embarrassment, the fear of losing everything he thought he controlled. The young man didn't scold him. He didn't need to. He simply laid out the future with calm clarity. The proper investigation, the violation of procedure, the failure to verify ownership, the breach of protocol, the disrespect shown on a customer's property. Each point was delivered like a quiet hammer, flattening what remained of the repo agent's confidence. There would be consequences, formal ones, written ones, permanent ones. The agent lowered his head, shoulders collapsing inward as the truth took hold. He managed to whisper something close to an apology, quiet, broken, barely audible. But the young man didn't acknowledge it. The apology wasn't for him. It was for the couple the agent had judged, underestimated, and humiliated. The young man turned to his parents, his expression softening for the first time since stepping into the confrontation. He placed a hand gently on Ernest's shoulder, a grounding gesture that undid the last remnants of the morning's pain. Ernest lifted his hand, resting it over his son's, a quiet thank you passing between them without a single spoken word. Leela stepped close, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. She touched her son's arm lightly, the warmth of her hand carrying every unspoken emotion, gratitude, relief, love, and the lingering ache of being underestimated. The three of them stood together, united, steady, unchanged by the attempt to diminish them. Behind them, the repo agent opened his truck door with a shaking hand. He climbed in slowly, the collapse of his posture visible even through the windshield. The engine sputtered to life, but he didn't drive away immediately. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel as if the world inside the truck was suddenly unfamiliar. Then, finally, he drove off, not with the confidence he had arrived with, but with the heavy, undeniable weight of a man facing the consequences of his own actions. The young man exhaled deeply, letting the last threads of tension leave his body. He turned toward his parents, and together they walked back toward the house, not triumphantly, not vengefully, but with the quiet dignity of people who had endured injustice and risen above it. And as they reached the porch, the sunlight breaking gently across their shoulders, an unspoken truth settled over the scene like a soft, steady promise. Justice does not always shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the calm voice of someone who knows exactly who they are, and in the steady steps of a family walking away whole.